welcome back to the Wellness Paradox podcast. I'm so grateful that you've joined us on this journey towards greater human flourishing. As always, I'm your host, Michael Stack, an exercise physiologist by training and a health entrepreneur and a health educator by trade. And I'm fascinated by a phenomena that I call the wellness paradox. That is the gap between what we know as a health sciences community and what we actually implement in the real world to make a real difference with real people. This podcast is all about closing off those gaps by disseminating the latest, most evidence-based, and most engaging information in the health sciences. And to do that today, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Ebony Parker-Featherstone from the University of Michigan's Medicine System. Dr. Ebony Parker-Featherstone, in addition to her work as a family medicine physician, is the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for Family Medicine at U of M. And this is going to be an amazing conversation that focuses around several topics related to DEI. And we've heard a lot about this in the past year and a half as the social justice movement has really taken root. But we actually need to think of this not just from a social justice perspective, but also from a clinical outcome perspective, as we'll talk about a little bit more in this podcast. I think you'll find this to be a fascinating conversation that actually is the interface of social justice as well as clinical care and patient and client care, depending on the population that you work with. Any additional information that we'd like to share in this podcast can be found on the show notes page by going to wellnessparadoxpod.com/episode 11. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Dr. Ebony Parker-Featherstone. Welcome back to the Wellness Paradox podcast. Today, we're delighted to be joined by Dr. Ebony Parker-Featherstone from Michigan Medicine. Dr. Parker-Featherstone, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michael, for having me. I'm happy to be here.
We're going to have a great conversation today around what I think is a very, very critically important topic. But before we launch into the conversation, just for some context, can you give our audience a little bit better of an idea of your background, what you do at Michigan Medicine as a practicing physician, but also what you're doing with some of the initiatives that we're going to talk about today?
Sure, happy to. So I am a faculty member in the Departments of Family Medicine and also Obstetrics and Gynecology. I completed my medical training here, so I've been at the University of Michigan for some time. I did med school residency and fellowship here and then stayed on after. I am a family physician by training, and so I'm doing primary care here at Michigan Medicine. And then I also have a joint appointment in Obstetrics and Gynecology where I do a focused kind of gynecology clinic. I also serve as the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the Department of Family Medicine. And so in that way, help to oversee our efforts around equity and inclusion in the department.
Awesome. Let's dive a little bit deeper into that. Your role as Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. What exactly does that mean strategically and operationally? Well, what are you doing?
Yeah, thanks. Great question. So in my role, my job really is to oversee our department efforts as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion, as you mentioned, which is often abbreviated as DEI, and then also antiracism, which is maybe a more recent member to that focus. Our mission really in the department is to create a climate that allows every member of our department to thrive and to ensure equity in our department processes and operations, as you mentioned, and across our mission area. So we have a focus that includes clinical care, education, and research. And so really ensuring equity across all of those missions is my job. I do that work, of course, in partnership with our department leadership, as well as our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee members and others throughout the department who are also passionate and engaged in this work.
Yeah, and certainly, I'm sure your job as a physician, it keeps you busy enough, and then you add this on top of it all. I'm sure that's quite a balancing act at the end of the day. But I'm curious for you to dive a little deeper, because our listeners of this podcast, some are in the medical field, some are other aspects of health sciences, others are just health enthusiasts in the population that are interested in learning more. What does some of these things practically look like at the implementation level inside of the health system, or things that you might be seeing on a day-by-day basis that are embracing more of DEI initiatives on the ground level? What do they look like?
So in our department, or in the health system in particular, I think if we looked at some specifics, so in each of those areas, I would say in our clinical care, for example, we've been thinking a lot about things that might be impacting care negatively. And so in addition to my role as Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for our department, I'm also a member of our Michigan Medicine Antiracism Oversight Committee, which I might talk about just a little bit. But through that lens, we've been looking at our clinical operations and where there's opportunity, where there is infrastructure in place that might not be allowing for equitable care for all members of our community. And so most recently, we released a change to our clinical calculator. So for those who might not know, there are tools that help us in clinical decision-making where you might input a patient's age or their gender or race or other things, right, as we're making clinical decisions. Some of those calculators included race in a way that might negatively impact a person's health outcome or the calculation thereof, and how that might guide or dictate treatment. So at Michigan Medicine, we recently discontinued the use of several of those health calculators, which included a race-based calculation, in an effort to be more inclusive in our care and stop any practice that might have been contributing to an anti-racist culture. So that would be one example of kind of a clinical operation change that represents our work around equity and anti-racism.
That's fascinating. Now, I'm interested in that. Can you maybe dive one layer deeper? Like, I'm trying to form this question on the fly here. So this calculator took race into consideration and resulted in a less positive or more negative clinical decision than if the calculator didn't exist. Am I getting that right?
That's about right. Correct. Yes, I'd say in general that would be that is why we've made some changes in that way. A good example of one I'll use, and that has already been made public, that we no longer use the former version of the calculator, would be a vaginal birth after cesarean calculator, which is often abbreviated as a VBAC calculator. So for a woman who has previously had a cesarean delivery, we often talk through or calculate their risk of then delivering vaginally. And that's because there are some risks in place if they've had surgery to the uterus and now are planning, right, to labor and consider a vaginal delivery. The calculator that we used to use included race as a risk, and often would adjust differently the percent of success with a vaginal delivery if that person was a person of color. And so women might have been steered towards cesarean delivery over, given the option for vaginal delivery with the use of that calculator. Now, of course, it's also worth saying that the calculator is one piece of the clinical equation, right? And so physicians and other can use or not use that information. So we're not suggesting that it ultimately dictated the care that patients provided, but even utilizing that tool and including it as one piece of data when we know that race is more of a social construct than it is, right, a biologic thing, and that dictates outcomes, have made the decision not to use those for which there was clear data that they did not impact outcomes in a particularly positive way.
Wow, yeah, that is fascinating. This kind of gets into the next question that I wanted to ask, and you've sort of answered it, but I'd like you to address it more broadly. It's specific to medicine. Why are DEI initiatives and anti-racism initiatives so critically important? I'd like you to unpack that a little bit more.
Oh, that's a great question. I think our attention to diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism, which I'll add in there, are so important because people's lives really do hang in the balance, right? People are dying, and some of them are dying, unfortunately, because of inequitable access to care and different outcomes based on pieces that they don't control. And so I think with COVID and the pandemic that we've recently gone through, and thankfully are hopefully seeing kind of light at the end of the tunnel, but I think COVID demonstrated so clearly what we already knew to be true regarding health disparities in this country and really around the world. and that the need for equitable and inclusive healthcare is really paramount, I think, in how we combat those health disparities. And our efforts around DEI and anti-racism in medicine is necessary to help address those kind of avoidable barriers to care that currently exist. So when we think about health equity, right, we think about every individual having the opportunity to achieve optimal health, and that also involves intentionally dismantling those barriers that are avoidable, but that impact a person's care. And so I think in medicine, it's critical that we are having these conversations and that we are making strides towards a more inclusive and equitable healthcare system, because that's how we improve care for every member of our community.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that very well said. I'm curious as to if you think COVID accelerated the need for DEI initiatives, or maybe some of the social justice issues that also occurred concurrently with COVID, if the climate accelerated DEI from your perspective.
Absolutely. I mean, I would say yes to that for sure. And while I don't think, while the need was no different pre-COVID, right? So what we knew about health disparities in this country and how there is disparate care depending on where you live or what you look like, or et cetera, right? That's not new information. But I think COVID, while there was so much negativity maybe surrounded by that pandemic, I think what was very positive, or what is a positive outcome of that, is that it laid to bear very clearly what that looks like practically, right? And so I think birthed out of that was, to your point, this very a very kind of passion around health equity and accelerating our efforts that maybe had not existed. Also, the social unrest that you mentioned, the racial pandemic that some would also call, right, in this, that has evolved over the last year and a half. And I think that together, and our social awareness as a nation, has really pushed this work forward in a way that I think it had not in times past. I agree. I think we're at a very unique and special time in history where great things are happening, right? And momentum is existing in a way that it had not previously, though the issues are not new, but maybe our commitment to addressing them in sustainable ways is new.
Yeah, it almost is a perfect positive storm of events that have really brought this to the forefront. I've asked this question to many people regarding many aspects of the pandemic, have it be what we're talking about, or just the greater emphasis on health behaviors as a result of what chronic conditions meant for people that were diagnosed with COVID. So I'm curious to get your perspective on it. How do we keep the momentum going in our 24-hour news cycle society, where it seems like what we heard about yesterday is forgotten about by today? How do we ensure that all the momentum that has been created by the social justice movement and the pandemic, how do we keep that going in years to come? Because this isn't going to be an issue that's going to be addressed by the end of 2021. This is a decades-long challenge. How do we keep that progress going?
That's a great question. I think first we have to recognize that issues of diversity, inclusion, even anti-racism aren't something to be solved, right? That it's not an issue that we check the box and move on. And I think historically that's how we have viewed these issues, and why maybe in medicine specifically, because that's what we're talking about, but even more broadly as a country, we've been unsuccessful in our efforts. I think now, at least in our institution, which I could maybe speak more succinctly to, I think there's the realization, and maybe even across the country, that our commitment to diversity, inclusion, et cetera, is inextricably linked to our commitment for excellence, right? To our commitment to kind of best work. We know that in general, diverse teams outperform less diverse teams, and that if we want to be excellent in medical care, if we want to have excellence in other sectors or other, that really diversity and inclusion have to be central to that work and effort. And so at Michigan Medicine, I'm really happy to see that we are intentional about ensuring that equity, that anti-racism are really part of the fabric of what we do, and are not a side issue, right, that a few folks are rallying around. That I think would be unsuccessful, and in times past has been just that. So I think as a nation, as a health system, really committing to equity and inclusion as core to how we operate, and to think about it in that way, right? That it should be part of our operations. It's part of our intrinsic value. It's how we do business. So I think that's one piece of it. Two, I think continuing to have conversations just like we are today, right? To ensure that this isn't something that was highlighted by the pandemic and then faded as the news cycle changed, as you mentioned. I think just continuing conversations about race, about equity, about inclusion, about the social determinants of health, and all the things that we know go into making sure, right, that individuals can achieve their optimal health, and not allowing that to fade into the background. So I think ongoing conversations, much like this one, ongoing education, but then also really committing, whether in your individual life or in our health systems and other, really to prioritizing equity and inclusion as core to our operations.
Yeah, the conversation just continually happening, I think is so important, because it is easy for things to fall off. You mentioned something that I think is important. You mentioned the social determinants of health, and these get talked about a lot. I'm going to ask a follow-up question, but first, can you briefly unpack the social determinants of health for people that maybe have heard the term but don't actually know what it means specifically?
Absolutely. So the social determinants of health are really the conditions in which a person are born that will impact their health. So it's where someone was born, it's where they live and work, it's their access to employment, to food, to transportation. And so we know that those issues impact a person's health or ability to achieve optimal health much more than clinical care ever will. So my piece of it as a practicing physician, right, is actually very small in the broader scheme of what contributes to a person's opportunity to achieve optimal health, and that their income and housing and access to nutrition and clean air, right, and transportation, et cetera, far outseeds what I might be able to do in my small sliver of it. And so when we think about health, we can't have that conversation about health and health equity without talking about the social determinants, which have a much greater impact on any one individual's health lifespan than clinical care ever will.
Yeah, it seems as if you deal with the very, very downstream consequences of the social determinants of health. The social determinants of health are the true, upstream nidus kind of the medical issues that you probably deal with. And I'm sure you see that on a day in, day out basis.
Absolutely. Yeah, and we know in this country, but really around the world, right, that health and illness kind of follow a social curve or gradient, right? And that unfortunately those with lower socioeconomic positions, however that's defined, also tend to have poorer health outcomes. And much of that, again, as we talked about, can be addressed and is avoidable in the sense that we can impact food insecurity. We can impact unfair housing practices, et cetera. And I'm saying we broadly, right, as a community. And those issues far outweigh what any one kind of medical intervention is able to do. We know that if we want to impact the health of communities, it starts with engaging that community around those social determinant issues. It involves investing in that community, right, and meeting the needs locally, advocating for dismantling those racist and unjust infrastructures that have kept certain communities, right, in poorer health than others. And I think I'm also really excited about how we're seeing more of medicine enter into that space where we realize that our ability to impact health really has to include those pieces.
Yeah, and this gets to my follow-up question, which is something that is often talked about, but I feel very misunderstood. And it's in the context of the social determinants of health, the concepts of personal responsibility and willpower. you hear often that, well, the unhealthy in our population just need to be more personally responsible for their health, and they just need more willpower to make healthier eating choices or exercise choices. Talk about how the social determinants of health are kind of a lens that allow us to look differently at the concepts of willpower and personal responsibility.
Absolutely. That's a great point. So I'm trying to think of a way to summarize that very succinctly, but so we'll give an easy example maybe that's coming to my mind, right? When you think about something like obesity or diabetes, for example, that have a lifestyle component, not only, but we know that physical activity, right, and healthy diet can help improve one's weight or blood sugar levels, etc. And while there is something to be said for personal responsibility for us as individuals and our personal health care, if you take a patient who is struggling, let's say, with weight and is wanting to work on weight loss, but that person lives in an environment that we might describe as a food desert. So they don't have access to healthy fruits, vegetables, etc. In their local environment, the grocery stores and other don't provide that. Or if they do, it's limited and it's high cost. If they live in an environment where sidewalks and streets are not maintained routinely, right? And so it's not necessarily safe for them to be outside and physically active, and they're not in an environment where healthcare centers or gyms are provided low cost, then while we might say, hey, you need to eat better and you need to be more active, how do they do that in the context of where they live, when so much of that is not dictated, right, by their personal decision making? They just happen to be born, right, in that environment. And so I think it's a great point that you bring up, but I think when we think about it from a systems level, there's so much that lies outside of what an individual has access to. And even for folks who really do want to do better, they're limited not only by their environment, but by discriminatory practices, right, and racist practices in this country that have created barriers, even for folks who really are attempting at a personal level to take steps in a positive fashion, right? I could give lots of examples in that regard too. And so when we think of the social determinants of health, it is really those things that are happening at a systems level and not something that any one individual can overcome. I might even give just a personal example for where I live, a little bit out more rural. There is no bus line. And so I happen to own a vehicle. But if I needed to catch the bus, I don't know, I think the closest stop is at least a 2-mile walk. And the environment I live in, while I love where I live and I don't mind driving, it's not conducive if I didn't have transportation, right? Those are little things, but if you think about how they add up to impact someone's health, it goes far beyond individual responsibility. And I think that narrative to suggest that just a bit more personal determination or willpower, right, would make the difference, I think that takes the onus off looking at the underlying infrastructure, right, which is really where we should be focusing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always fascinating how these conversations that start pretty narrow, talking about DEI at Michigan Medicine, expand very quickly to the larger political ecosystem and our policy decisions. I'm curious, from your perspective as a physician who works in this every day, not just in practice, but also focusing on DEI and anti-racism, from a policy perspective, and not that I'd like to turn these conversations into politics because those seem to never go anywhere good, but how, from your perspective, how are we doing at the policy level addressing some of these things? From your standpoint, are there glaring issues that we're facing that we could be looking at a little bit more aggressively? What's your thoughts on that?
Wow. In general, I would say yes, and I'm not a health policy expert, right? And so I don't want to speak too broadly on areas that I am less well versed in, but I think there are lots of opportunities in our local communities for how we advocate for change, right? I think a food desert is a great example. And even in our local communities here in Washtenaw counties, there are areas where it is much more difficult to have access to healthy food, produce, etc. There are lots of community programs that help to combat that, which is really excellent. But I think there is opportunity in our local communities for how we address these from a systems-based kind of infrastructure area. And so there's work definitely to be done, but I think some of that work is in progress, and that's what's exciting to see.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you mentioned the concept of food deserts and getting healthier food into lower income communities. For those of you that are consistent listeners of the podcast, you could be referred back to episode 7 with Orrin Hesterman from the Fair Food Network. And I'm not sure, you're shaking your head, maybe you've heard of Fair Food, but for those that didn't listen to that episode, that is a program through SNAP benefits or food stamps that allow you to double your spending on fruits and vegetables at certain retailers through the SNAP program, which is an amazing way to combat this at a very localized level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great example of how we can impact folks' health, right, in a very real-time way.
Yeah, and there's a lot more of that I think needs to be done. And to your point, I do think a lot of this is in progress, but also to your point, what gets things across the finish line in politics is there being conversation around it. The louder the conversation, the larger the conversation, the more that moves lawmakers because they hear it impacts their constituents. So I hope that one byproduct of a conversation like this is more people start talking about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think conversation is key, as we mentioned earlier. And I think, as you alluded to before, since the pandemic, I think we have seen more advocacy in this way, right? We have seen more people lobbying for improvements in their local neighborhoods and communities where they've seen inequities, where we know that there's infrastructure in place that are limiting opportunities for certain groups. And so I think these conversations are just what is necessary to kind of continue to catapult those issues forward. And then kind of working with, as you mentioned, our legislators, lawmakers, those who kind of help put that policy in place. Healthcare advocacy, is an important piece of that. And so having these conversations is just the place, I think, to start. And then working with local government and others to think about then how we impact those changes.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a couple of thoughts that are coming to my mind that I want to talk about that are a little divergent, but I think the first thing I want to ask about is in relationship to health literacy. We hear that talked about a lot, and we talked about personal responsibility and how that is a small element of it, but part of it is kind of understanding your health and being literate in your health. How do you feel we're doing as a medical community with ensuring health literacy in our population at large, and maybe where could we do better?
So from a health literacy standpoint, I think we're making strides in understanding that in order to impact health, this is at the healthcare level now, of course, that we're talking about, ensuring that patient provider communication and kind of health system, right, communication is happening in such a way that a patient leaves understanding what has taken place, right, in the healthcare encounter, understands the healthcare plan. I think we've come a long way in terms of recognizing the need for that and kind of tailoring our conversation. So, for example, in our department, in our institution, there are opportunities to have information that we're planning to provide to patients be reviewed by kind of health literacy specialists who can make sure we're using appropriate language, right, and reading level appropriate content such that we're meeting patients where they are. I'm thinking about our interpreter and transcription services or other to make sure that health information is available in a patient's native language, right? Just thinking about all the ways in which we can try to ensure better communication with our patients. It also ties into our conversation about diversity and inclusion and other, sometimes even just having a provider, physician, or other healthcare team member that you feel you can communicate with well, right? And we know that when patients have physicians and healthcare providers who look like them, that they rate that as a higher level of satisfaction and care, right? And so this all ties in together, our efforts around diversity and inclusion, our efforts around ensuring that patients are getting health information at a level they can understand and a language that they understand, right? And I think in the way in which they want to receive it, right? Another thing that COVID has allowed us to do maybe more quickly than we would have otherwise is the adoption of virtual care and other. So sending our patients electronic resources, right? That's not for everyone, right? Not everyone has access to that, but for those who do or want to receive it in that way, I think we are being more intentional about the ways in which we communicate with our patients and ensuring we're doing it in a way that helps meets their needs. I'll also add that this is where topics like cultural humility and other come into play, that we're communicating not only our the knowledge or healthcare plan or other, but that we're listening to our patients, right? I think in medicine, we've done a lot of work more recently about just the skill of listening and understanding how a person's culture, how their upbringing or other might impact their desires for health, right? And what the patient's hoping to get out of that healthcare experience. And so in that regard, I think that we're moving forward in the right way.
Yeah, it seems like it's such a stark contrast from the all-knowing expert physician that's just going to provide a diatribe for 10 minutes about what a patient needs to do and then leave the room. It seems like it's the shift is really happening to more of a collaborative type of relationship that really does make it more patient-centric.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's the right word, right? Patient-centered care is definitely what we aim to provide, and we know provides better outcome, right? When a patient feels as though there's trust in that patient-provider relationship, again, when they feel comfortable to share honestly, and leaves understanding the plan of care, we know that that patient is going to have a better health outcome than a patient who didn't understand or didn't feel heard or listened to, right? And so I think so much of our work as physicians and healthcare providers has been about understanding how to do that better, right? And to receive the training necessary. It's a skill, right? To actively listen. It's a skill to help develop a plan of care that it's in line with that person's personal care goals. And so in fairness, right, maybe to all of the healthcare providers and other, it's not easy to do, but having the tools available, I think, is what's so important. And so at Michigan Medicine, I'm so excited to say that we do have those resources available and that our trainees, our physicians and others are learning those skills about how to provide care that's patient-centered in that way.
Yeah, it seems like that's something that happens post medical school. From all of my friends who've gone through medical school and residency, it seems like that's when you're just deluged with science and more of the tactical aspects of care. And it seems like after you get into practice, you learn more of those patient-centric skills. Is that kind of how the process has evolved?
I would say some of that is true in the sense that when you're kind of fully immersed in clinical care, right, that you get more practice. But I would say at least for the University of Michigan, our medical school students are getting experience from the very beginning. And so we have some introduction to the patient sessions. Our second year students are involved. We've moved the clinical care, clinical experiences up. And so it used to historically be the first and second years of medical school were all kind of the science, right? And then the third and fourth years were clinical. We've moved those experiences up because we know that from the very beginning, understanding how, right, to relate to patients, how you might interact with them, that's important from the start. And so more recently, I think even our students would comment that they're getting this training from the very beginning. We know that to wait and then assume that someone's going to be able to relate appropriately with patients if they've not had any prior experience is probably not the best way to do it. And so we have moved those experiences up. And I say we broadly, I don't oversee medical school, right, curriculum or education, but that has occurred and I think has really been a positive experience both for our students and even for our patients and other that are, right, our trainees are getting those experiences very early on.
Yeah, so important. It's your emotional intelligence is as a physician and a healthcare provider, every bit as important as your intellectual intelligence, it seems.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. They go hand in hand.
You mentioned something almost as if you read my mind, because it was the second question that I was going to ask when I asked this first question. It was about patients communicating with a provider that they're comfortable with, a provider that looks like them, maybe talks like them, lives in the same community as them. I think that's something that sometimes doesn't get talked about as much. So I'm curious what your perspective is on what we're doing to create more diversity in terms of students entering medical school, because ultimately, that's going to dictate the downstream outcome of there being a physician there that is actually able to relate to somebody because they come from the same cultural and ethnic background. What's your perspective on how we're doing with that? And maybe if you do have a perspective on it, how can we do better?
Oh, I think we're moving in the right direction, right? Let me say that. I think there's still challenges when you think about medical school specifically, which I think is what, right, we're talking about at the moment, medical school kind of enrollment and matriculation, that we have not maybe yet achieved parity, at least with the populations we serve, right? For enrolling kind of students of various backgrounds, such that they reflect that community. There's still work to be done. I think there's a recognition of that need. And so, have specific kind of infrastructure in place to address it. But do I think there's work to be done? Absolutely. I was part of a resource recently where we watched a documentary about Black men in white coats, and it talked about how there were more Black men in medical school in the 1970s, I believe, than there are now in 2020 and 2021, right? That enrollment is down. That's a very specific group, obviously, of people thinking about our Black male physician population, but it's just a microcosm of what we see maybe for persons of color and other. And so how can we do better in that way? I would say some of our efforts at the institution level around that, being very clear about the need, as you mentioned, for broader diversity in our physician workforce, which starts, I would argue, and many have, that it starts way before medical school, right? That we're talking about primary and secondary education, right? We're talking about access to STEM. We're talking about seeing very early on what could be a possibility in the future, right? That by the time you get to medical school, that person's hopefully going to do fairly well. But investing early on is where we know the data shows opportunity and outcome. And so at Michigan Medicine, we have very robust kind of what are described as pipeline programs, right? Where we kind of start very early and building up, hopefully, a pipeline of students who are interested in science and in healthcare and medicine, and provide support all along the way so that they see medicine as a path for them, should that be something they're interested in, and then provide the tools, resources, support necessary, right, for them to then be successful. And so whether that be our programs in the schools, right, whether that be the scholarship programs that the university has available, there are lots of opportunity for how we invest in the education, right, of students at every level, such that they are able to be successful and then hopefully ultimately matriculate through medical school for those who are interested in that path specifically.
Yeah, you said it. It does start in primary school and secondary school. It's the fifth grader saying, I want to grow up to be a doctor one day, that makes a difference. So that's such a good and interesting point. I'm curious right now, where you feel we're falling the most short in terms of DEI in medicine. And I don't necessarily mean at Michigan Medicine specifically, but just broadly speaking. We've made a lot of progress, but I'm sure there are areas that there are bigger gaps than others. Is there any one or two areas that you can think of in particular?
Broadly, I think if you'd say, gosh, where are we falling short? I think one that we maybe hinted at earlier is thinking historically. I think diversity, equity, inclusion work and anti-racism work has been thought of as a topic area, right? A separate thing where you can take a training and now be proficient. And we know now, I think that is a falsity, right? And that really incorporating these principles into operations and into the core value is really necessary. And so I think there has been a shift in that way. But I think if you asked me where kind of in the broader medical community there was opportunity, I think there's still much work to be done in medicine about addressing the climate and culture in medicine that really values diversity and inclusion and anti-racism as core to the mission of what we do, as much as clinical care, education, and research are part of the fabric, right? That committing to equity in that care is just as important. I'm happy to say that at Michigan Medicine, inclusion is one of our core values, right? Along with innovation, caring, integrity, and teamwork. And so I think we are really working to establish that value as core and are moving in that right direction. But I think as a global medical community, recognizing health as a human right and partnering with communities to do that is important. And I would say the first is kind of integrating that into the fabric of what we do. The second, I think, is then partnering to ensure health as a human right for all is another area where I think there's still work to be done.
Health is a human right. I think that, I think life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You think of those terms, and it is one of those basic, inalienable human rights. That's such a good commentary. Well, let's go to the flip side. Your role likely gives you the opportunity to connect with many people in the DEI ecosystem, probably both inside of Michigan Medicine and outside. What gives you excitement for the future? At this point, what kind of lights you on fire about where this is going from a positive perspective?
Oh, yeah. Wow. So I'm going to say just this conversation makes me happy, right? I think not only the conversation we're having right now, but the broader conversations that are happening really across the country, right? As we think about how we provide better healthcare. I think so many were disappointed with the outcomes from COVID, right? For very appropriate reasons. But it provided a catalyst for us to really address some of the hard issues that exist in our country and exist in our healthcare infrastructure. And I'm really optimistic when I see the level of engagement and conversation that is happening. I'm also really excited about what I'll call the younger generation, which is hard to say without making yourself feel old, right? But when I think about our students, even at the University of Michigan, our medical students and trainees and others who really have been demanding change and have been an incredible catalyst for the work that we're doing in our institution, but I'm sure is true kind of across the country and other institutions as well, that I think this younger generation really sees clearly where there's opportunity and where there are areas that we have not maybe yet taken action as we should have in the past and are moving that forward. I think that is also a really exciting kind of place to be. And lastly, I would say just the coming together that many of us, at least in the healthcare environment, have witnessed in the last year and a half with the pandemic, that so many of us have come together in really unprecedented ways to help address, right, the issues that the pandemic brought to bear, and that coming together despite our differences and rallying around a common goal. I think the lessons learned from that experience are also invaluable and demonstrate the resiliency of the human spirit and what we can achieve when we work together. And so I'm really excited about the opportunity to carry that work forward and continue with that same momentum.
That's great. Yeah, the task is daunting, but the future is bright, and it is heartening to hear the next generation. And I totally agree. Every time you say that, you do date yourself pretty significantly, but it is exciting to hear, and that seems to, in general, be the younger generation seems to be a very socially motivated generation around social justice and social causes, and that is reason for hope and faith in the future. So I definitely appreciate that perspective. Where can people go if they want to find out more about DEI initiatives and anti-racism initiatives at Michigan Medicine, or maybe even other resources that you think would be useful for people to learn a little bit more about this?
Absolutely. Well, one for Michigan Medicine in particular, folks can go to the diversity webpage for the institution. That would be diversity.med.umich.edu. And there they can learn more about what we're doing at Michigan Medicine. Obviously, in our Department of Family Medicine and things that we're doing, they can check out our department website, which would be med.umich.edu/FamMed, FAMMED. The University of Michigan, I know we also referenced the Antiracism Oversight Committee. Mm-hmm. And so you can also, through the diversity website I mentioned, get to the AROC page, mm-hmm. which is how we abbreviate that. And then I also want to highlight, I don't know if I had mentioned previously, our Office for Health Equity and Inclusion, but you can also get to many of this information as well as additional resources through their website, which is ohei.med.umich.edu.
Awesome. And we will link up to all of those in the show notes with all the acronyms and med.
Right, I know.
I'm sure that sounds like letter soup at this point, but we'll make sure everyone gets linked up to these things. And for all of our listeners, we've just scratched the surface on this. This is a very, very complex topic. It's very, very nuanced. And Dr. Parker-Featherstone, you've done a great job at really articulating this well, but at the same time, we can't do justice to this in a 45 to 50 minute podcast. So I think to keep the conversation going, for those of you that are interested, dive into some of these resources, learn a little bit more, particularly if some of the things that were talked about today were novel to you. And that knowledge really can be powerful in terms of making change.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would agree. Thank you. Yeah, there's so much more that could be said. This is just the start, but it's an excellent starting place. So I appreciate you for the opportunity to have this conversation. The other thing I would just end with is to say, for our listeners who are interested in more, there are lots of resources to even self-directed learning or other, which are on the websites I'd mentioned, but also for our University of Michigan community, the Organizational Learning Office has a wealth of resources, tools, trainings, self-directed learning, et cetera. And so for those who are interested in knowing more, you can also go to the HR website, hr.umich.edu/diversity to see the catalog of information that exists. We're really lucky to be at an institution that has no lack of access to resource and information. And so from full on courses, right, to webinars, to self-modules. There's a lot of information there for folks who are wanting to take the next step as it relates to this work.
Awesome. And we will link up to all those, as I said. Well, we're coming to a close here, and I want to end on the question that I always end the podcast on, because it's the title of the podcast, and it's the wellness paradox, as I view it, is the gap between what we know as a health sciences community and what we actually implement in the real world to make a real difference with real people. And I'm curious as to your perspective on what is one thing that we can do, and it could be divorced from what we talked about today, or it could be directly related to what we talked about today. What is one thing we can do as a health sciences community to close off that gap?
One thing I'd say to close the gap in general, but maybe more specifically for what we've talked about today, Michael, I think would be committing to action. That you're right, there's a lot that we know, and even as it relates to health equity and there's a lot we know, but committing to action, committing to taking a step from what I know, right, and kind of implementing that to make a difference, I think would be an appropriate next step for all of us in this community. And so committing to action, whether that's self-directed learning, and I know we've given lots of resources, whether that is calling out inequity when you see it, whether that is, right, investing in your community. There are lots of ways to get involved, but I'd argue committing to one action that you might take away either from this conversation or right from other pieces of that wellness paradox would be a really important next step.
Awesome. Such a great point. Dr. Ebony Parker-Featherstone, thank you so much for joining us on the Wellness Paradox podcast.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michael. Happy to be here.
Well, I hope you found that conversation with Dr. Parker-Featherstone as insightful and useful as I did. If you did so, please share with your friends and colleagues. Those shares really do make a difference for us. Any information that we're looking to share from this episode can be found on the show notes page by going to wellnessparadoxpod.com/episode 11. Please be on the lookout for next week's episode when it drops on Wednesday. And don't forget to subscribe through your favorite podcast platform. Until we chat again, please be well.